afternoon, everyone. I'm Russ Feingold. I'm the president of the American Constitution Society. And I'd like you to feel welcome to today's briefing call entitled, "Is the End in Sight? The Questionable Future of Capital Punishment in America." I believe the question this title poses is optimistic, but I don't think it's naive. While it may be hard to imagine as we brace for this evening's execution of Orlando Hall, the 8th federal execution in 4 short months, this country and its people are at a tipping point of finally rejecting the idea that death is justice. Popular support for the death penalty is at its lowest point in years. In March, Colorado abolished the death penalty, becoming the 22nd state to do so. 3 additional states have imposed moratoria, meaning that for the first time in history, half the states in the Union functionally have no death penalty, and at least 7 other states haven't executed a person in over a decade. As of July, there had been only 13 new death sentences imposed nationwide and only 7 state-level executions in 2020. For the 6th year in a row, the United States is on track to execute fewer than 30 people and sentence fewer than 50 people to death. We may even be on track to have the fewest executions and death sentences in decades. But we all know it's foolish to celebrate before crossing the finish line. And there is simply no more stark reminder of that than what we recently witnessed at the federal level. At times it seems that President Trump is in a macabre race to execute as many people as possible before leaving office. The administration continues a breakneck pace of executions, despite serious concerns in individual cases about the condemned's culpability and whether their death will serve justice, as well as broader systemic concerns about the racism and socioeconomic bias that infect the death penalty. And yet I maintain my optimism and I have hope. And I'm eager to hear from the experts who have joined us today about their thoughts on the future of the death penalty and whether they might share my optimism. So now I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, MAURICE, who is a staff writer for the Marshall Project, a nonprofit news organization that covers the U.S. criminal justice system. MAURICE is also the author of the forthcoming book, "Let the Lord Sort Them: The Rise and Fall of the Death Penalty," which won the 2019 Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Book Award. His book charts the rise and fall of capital punishment in Texas and what it tells us about crime and punishment in America through the eyes of those it touched. So this makes him an ideal person to lead today's discussion. MAURICE?
Thank you so much, Russ, and thank you, American Constitution Society, for hosting this today. I've been looking forward to this discussion. As you mentioned, there is an execution tonight, a federal execution. It's the 8th of the year. But strangely, the president, who sort of free associates in so many areas of policy and kind of brings up whatever he wants, has not mentioned these executions very much. And so if anyone has sort of thoughts on that, I'd be curious to kind of get into it. A few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's call is going to be recorded, and the recording will be available on ACS's website, acslaw.org. At the end of our remarks, after about 45 minutes of discussion or so, we will be taking questions. And if you would like to ask a question of our panelists, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can type the question in there and we will try to get to it. And then finally, there's 1 hour of California CLE credit is available for this call. If you are interested in obtaining that, you can email info@acslaw.org with the subject, "Is the End in Sight? The Questionable Future of Capital Punishment in America," which is our title. And you can, of course, ask myself or ACS for more information on that. We have some great panels today, some real experts on capital punishment and on its decline. Many of them come from the world of defense law, where defense lawyers have been very kind of critical in the larger story of the decline of the death penalty, have played a really key role, and so I think they're sort of well disposed to talk about the future. We have Tarika Redfield-Ganzi, the Deputy Director at the Southern Center for Human Rights, Sam KAMIN, Professor of Law at University of Denver, Sturm College of Law, and Laura Porter, the Executive Director of the Eighth Amendment Project. Sam, I'd like to start with you for kind of the lay of the land in terms of the Supreme Court and the larger picture of capital punishment. Some of the listeners may remember that around 5 years ago, there was a discussion, particularly among defense lawyers, about whether to bring challenges to the death penalty as a whole, the entire system, up to the Supreme Court to challenge whether it violated the Eighth Amendment. This is, of course, what happened in the 1970s. The Supreme Court struck down all of the state laws concerning the death penalty, and then the states had to rewrite them, and the death penalty returned in the late 70s. It seemed like that sort of moment was going to potentially repeat itself about 5 years ago, towards the end of the Obama administration. I'm curious, what has changed since then? How has the makeup of the Supreme Court made this more or less of a thinkable future? And what lessons for the sort of national picture of the death penalty do you see outside of the courts, outside of the Supreme Court? You are, of course, speaking from Colorado, which abolished the death penalty this year. So I'm curious how that reflects on the national picture vis-a-vis the Supreme Court.
Thank you for that question, Maurice. Thanks to RUSS and to ACS for the invitation. There's a lot there in that question. I think that you're absolutely right. There was great optimism maybe 3 to 5 years ago that the death penalty was on the wane, and largely for the reasons that Russ mentioned in his introduction. The use of the death penalty by prosecutors, its imposition by juries, the number of executions were all dropping and have been dropping steadily and continue to drop in the United States as a whole. There are regions of the country, the American West, that have gone now more than 10 years without an execution at the state level. So there really seemed to be developing a momentum toward some sort of tipping point, right? That all of the empirical data seem to be pointing in that direction. I think it may have been a little optimistic at the level of the Supreme Court. That is, I think there have never been a majority of the court that looked ready to undo the death penalty, particularly as you point out, a facial challenge to it. I think the closest we probably got was in the Hidalgo case in 2018, and there was a challenge to the Arizona death penalty that was brought on the basis of failure to narrow. That is, that an empirical study of Maricopa County in Arizona showed that nearly everyone who was charged with murder in that county was eligible for the death penalty. And this went against the Supreme Court's precedents in Furman and thereafter, that to be constitutional, a death penalty statute must meaningfully narrow the pool of murders to a smaller group against whom the penalty could be lawfully imposed. And the Arizona study certainly seemed to indicate that Arizona was not living up to that constitutional requirement. 4 justices concurred in the decision not to hear that case, but certainly indicated their willingness to take up a properly designed and structured non-narrowing challenge. Unfortunately, Justice Ginsburg, who was one of those 4 justices, is no longer with us. And it's unclear whether any of the justices who did not join that opinion, the other 6 justices on the court now, would share that. So as you rightly pointed out, that moves us either to the state courts or to the legislatures, both of which have been fairly receptive to challenges. It was mentioned that Colorado, my state, abolished the death penalty earlier this year through legislation, and the governor commuted the sentence of the 3 men who remained on death row, meaning that Colorado currently has neither a death row nor a death penalty statute. Washington, Delaware, Connecticut, other states have done this. And, as Russ mentioned in the introduction, we're now moving toward a majority of the states not having active death penalties. So I think, and I'm curious what other panelists and what others think of this, but, it does seem that is an attractive means for undoing the practice of capital punishment in the United States.
Thank you for that. Tarika, I'd like to bring you in. The sort of first question I have for you is about how to think about the death penalty in relation to the larger questions of the criminal legal system and racial justice that were raised through protests this summer. Of course, the police killing of George Floyd, it was not a death penalty case, but there was, a huge sort of groundswell of interest and thought that went into the ways in which the legal system, continues to have really troubling racial disparities. This is something we know to be true of the death penalty. But I'm curious how you think about the summer's protests and the issues they raised in relation to the sort of larger effort to abolish the death penalty, whether politically or legally.
Thanks, Maurice. I think the first thing I would say is that it's amazing what people can do when they, as in the word of the great Fannie Lou Hamer, get sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I think that's what we have seen and continue to see throughout this summer and even continuing into now, is that people are just tired. They are exhausted by the injustice, by the cruelty, and they are raising their voices. And I would say not that it will have an impact on the death penalty. I think that it is currently having an impact, and I would say that it's having an impact in a few ways. First, funding to support organizations like the Southern Center for Human Rights, like the Center for Death Penalty Litigation, like ACLU, all of these nonprofit organizations that are doing the work. Funding has increased tremendously to support this work, including death penalty defense work. And then it's coming from a number of different avenues of corporations that would not typically, in years past, not typically even touch criminal justice with a 10-foot pole, are actively seeking out opportunities to engage with and support organizations that are working toward racial justice, particularly in the criminal legal system. And it's made a lot of headlines that foundations, for example, are shifting and expanding their focuses to include funding for efforts to combat racism and in numerous arenas, education, et cetera, but particularly also related to criminal justice. And so the uprising has sort of created an impetus for folks to act now, not later, to do something right now and to engage in a strong and meaningful way. And so I would say that is a wonderful result that is happening right now. And I think another thing is that communities are realizing their power to affect change. And when I say that, I'm thinking of even with this most recent election, where some prosecutors who had terrible histories got the boot. The voters said, "We have had enough of you and we're done with you." And I'm specifically thinking of Jackie Johnson in Brunswick, Georgia, who was the prosecutor on the Ahmaud Arbery case, no longer has that job. And that's because the communities have, they've risen up and they're honing their power and using it to impact structural change. And I think elected officials are taking notice. They can no longer usher criminal justice reform to the back burner or cover over it or dismiss it, because the communities are not allowing folks to do that. And so I would say that is a wonderful change. And I'm not saying that, grassroots organizations and grassroots, activists were not doing this all along, because, it's a long history of folks fighting to end racial injustice in the criminal legal system. But I just want to uplift that the civil unrest this summer has really brought heightened focus on the need for communities to stand up. And then I would say that, I've noticed that states and legislatures are actively and right now creating changes. So for example, in California, doing great work. They're passed the Racial Justice Act. They passed legislation that makes it more difficult to use race to inflate IQ scores for people who are intellectually disabled based on race. And they have passed legislation that focuses on racism and racial bias and racial discrimination in jury selection. And so they take Batson a step further by not just outlawing intentional racial discrimination, but also unconscious bias. So I think that's something that just happened in September. And I do think the civil unrest, gave folks cover to go strong and to have a strong vision for what this reform could look like. In North Carolina, the governor there created a task force for racial equity in the criminal justice system. And that just happened this summer as well, to recommend solutions to stop discriminatory law enforcement and criminal justice practices. And so I would say that these things demonstrate that people are standing up and taking notice, and that I anticipate that because the death penalty is sort of the ultimate form of, the racism, the bias, the classism expressed throughout the criminal legal system is highlighted with the death penalty, because it is sort of the ultimate punishment. It is the punishment that we cannot walk back once it's administered. And I do think that people are they're tired and they're standing up. And I feel optimistic that people will continue to stand up and hold people accountable, and that those things will create change. And I think finally, I'll just say that I am eager to see what happens when Joe Biden gets sworn in. He made a promise to the Black community. And I'm anticipating that people will hold him accountable to the promises that he's made. And specifically that criminal justice reform is a topic that is a high priority in the Black community, because Black communities are the communities that's most impacted negatively by racism and criminal justice and the death penalty specifically.
Thank you for that. That's actually a very nice segue to what I was going to ask Laura, which is particularly about the Biden era, or the coming Biden era, assuming there's a peaceful transition of power and everything. So Trump oversaw more execution than any president in decades, I think maybe 60 or 70 years. This came even as states were carrying out fewer and fewer executions. Of course, other than the federal government's executions, COVID had a really big effect on this. District attorneys were obtaining fewer death sentences. I'm curious, Laura, if you could kind of comment on the disconnect between, that decline at the state level and the ramp up of executions under Trump, and then what you expect under Biden, what the, efforts for opponents of the death penalty look like under the Biden administration, with a president who has, at least on the record, said that he opposes capital punishment and would like to get rid of it. But there's, of course, always a question of how much of a priority it's going to be. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. I really agree with your assessment that there is a huge disconnect between what is going on with the Trump administration, the death penalty, and what is going on with the rest of the world. And, you know, we have so much evidence of that, which Russ, you know, kind of mentioned at the beginning in terms of the whole country moving away and the number of sentences, the brilliant work done by the Southern Center to stop executions and reduce death sentences, among many others. But it's also really interesting to note that that there's a lot of work by a lot of folks working to change the criminal legal system that is bipartisan, and that there seems to be growing interest. So right now, there are 4 states that you know, our movement is very hopeful would possibly repeal the death penalty, be next on the list in the next two or 3 years. And 3 of those states are currently controlled by Republicans. And it's Ohio, Wyoming, and Utah, and Virginia. So it's really, really interesting. So we have a southern state there, former home of the Confederacy. We have Ohio that is currently not executing anyone. The governor of Ohio has stopped executions from moving forward because of concerns about obtaining the drugs. But he's not gotten any pushback. You know, he's very comfortable in his position to not let executions move forward. And there's a Republican-led effort in the legislature right now to support repeal of the death penalty that will then be supported, of course, by progressives, the Black Caucus, other folks in Ohio. And that is replicating in Virginia and in Wyoming and Utah. There are both also very strong Republican-led efforts in the death penalty there. So, you know, there is a disconnect for sure in terms of how the Trump administration is behaving around the death penalty, which is appalling and so out of step with the rest of the country, while the rest of it is moving away. I think that the brilliant work done by activists on the ground in the Black Lives Matter movement and by really lifting the national conversation around race is really going to also impact what happens when Biden takes over. As Tara named, there's a lot to hold Biden accountable for. But I also think it's really interesting and to note, you know, Russ Feingold, who has, you know, often at one point was quite lonely among his Democratic colleagues in being opposed to the death penalty, I'm old, many years ago, has now a lot of company. And I believe that this is because the death penalty is no longer the third rail in the political sphere anymore. And that now Biden, who is a proponent of the death penalty through much of his life, when he decided to run for president, articulated why he changed his mind. And I believe it, you know, I'm guessing it's a sincere change of mind, but it's also a political change of mind, is that the country has moved away from the death penalty. And I don't think there was a viable Democratic candidate running for president this year who didn't oppose the death penalty. And everyone was very quick all the time to support ending the death penalty. So it's really, really interesting where we are. You know, Biden has said in his platform that he wants to end the federal death penalty. He said he wants to incentivize states to end the death penalty. I'm not sure what that will look like, but I find that an exciting notion. But most importantly, in the last few days, as these federal executions are piling up one and one after each other, there's been a lot of media about how that's going to dramatically change as soon as Biden takes over. And just as someone who's been in this movement for so long, I find that so hopeful, because it's said even before he takes office, like, oh, of course he's going to do this, and there's no pushback. There's like an understanding that Biden is going to stop executions as soon as he takes over. I hope that happens, but the fact that the media is already portraying like that's what's going to happen, I find really exciting and fascinating as well. I do expect that to happen. I think they're going to, you know, the Justice Department is going to have to take a good look at itself. I think Biden is going to have to figure out how he's going to weigh in, but I do think that the executions will stop, and as they look for ways to kind of get into the issue further. And I'll just end on this, which is that, we have not thought that ending the federal death penalty in our movement was high on the list, because we've had such success in the states. And as we know, the Congress is so polarized and so messy and awful. But I do, just to close on this note of this theme, is that, there was a very, very conservative Republican who just got elected from Montana to enter, who's going to be entering Congress as their sole Congress member. And he was a founding member of conservatives concerned about the death penalty in Montana, which then ended up being a national organization that we helped them build tonight. But he is, very comfortable in his skin, has been attacked throughout his political life in the Republican Party for being anti-death penalty. It has never held him back. And now he's a member of Congress. And, and it's just like, I think it's going to be slow. I don't want to tell you all that I think that Congress is going to end the death penalty in the next year or so, but I think the dialogue is going to be a lot stronger and move a lot further along than when RUSS was like one of the only holdouts there. So.
I'd like to follow up on that quickly, and really any of the panelists can jump in, but since we're talking about the federal death penalty in particular, it's my understanding that Congress would need to actually abolish it, but that Biden could do, as president, the executive branch could do quite a bit through the DOJ to sort of all but stop it, whether it's dismantling the death chamber in Terre Haute, Indiana as a big symbolic move, or directing the attorney general, or picking an attorney general who's very anti-death penalty and who can sort of direct prosecutors, even overrule them, and really reduce the number of federal, not just federal death sentences, but attempts to get them. I'm curious if any of you have thoughts on what pressuring Biden looks like, and what those sort of DOJ related mechanisms, especially at the earlier stages, not just executions, but, pre-trial, a case comes in, a murder happens tomorrow. What are the ways that lawyers are going to be looking to keep that case from becoming a death penalty case?
I didn't know if I said something.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was sort of for anyone, but Laura, please go for it.
I'll let the folks. I'm not a practicing attorney right now because I've been on the advocacy side, so I'll let the folks that are doing the litigation speak first.
Well, I'm not doing that litigation. I'm an academic, but Maurice, you mentioned a number of the things that are available. Yes, to eliminate the death penalty at the federal level, it would require an act of Congress. But you're also right that as the head of the executive branch and the person who appoints the attorney general, President-elect Biden would have a number of opportunities, and you mentioned some of them, right? They're requiring sign-off from the Attorney General before a death sentence can be sought, requiring sign-off on an execution. You mentioned dismantling the death chamber. He could impose a moratorium on execution. So there are lots of things that are available. Now, obviously, the federal death penalty in the broader context is largely symbolic. Almost all executions happen at the state level, which is why so much of the focus has been there. But and I don't mean to imply that any death is symbolic or not important. But the people are being executed in southern states, in Texas and elsewhere. There's not much that Biden can do about that, though. Conditioning spending on or federal cooperation on states, either reducing or changing the way they impose death, is another opportunity that's available to a president and an attorney general.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'd like to sort of ask all of you, and hope any of you could kind of jump in. I mean, to me, one question that's raised by all of your comments is the idea that, sort of in keeping with the polarization in this country that we saw coming out of the presidential election, where like half the country doesn't really understand the other half, it does appear that you'll have, maybe a few more states join the column of states without the death penalty, but you'll sort of then have almost like a geographic polarization, a disparity where, there's no signs of it slowing down in Texas, for example. A lot of states stopped carrying out executions this year, but there's every reason to think that some other southern states, Florida, South Carolina, is potentially going to come back online with executions. It's just sort of going to keep going there. So I guess the question is, do you envision a future in which it sort of concentrates more and more geographically, and how does that then impact the effort? Once you've abolished the death penalty in all the states where it seems like you have a shot, what happens next?
That's a question that we obsess about as a movement, morning, noon, and night, and a very good one. I think that it's going to take so many pieces to come together, particularly in the South, which itself is changing as a politically dynamic. And we're looking what's happening in Georgia, states like North Carolina, that are conversations about racism and the legal system are going to be lifted and are going to be stronger, and it's not going to end, and I think that's going to play into moving them along the spectrum. But what we really learned in terms of how you get from those states that you're saying, like kind of one the easier a little bit to tick off, take off the list, to getting to one where the harder ones, kind of overriding a cultural history and attachment to the death penalty. What we have found is that the way that you do that is to create space for dialogue for the change is you have to reduce use. You have to reduce use of the death penalty to get the policy and decision makers comfortable in a space to have a dialogue about ending it. So what our strategy is and in Texas, as you are well aware, Texas's use of the death penalty is astronomical at the execution side. But in the last several years, it's been single digits in the front end, in the new sentences. And so we need to get states who've been using the death penalty to a position where they're not using the death penalty. And that's through reducing death sentences and trying our best to stop executions. But reducing it at the front end is the most effective way to do that. And when states are not using the death penalty as much anymore, as you notice, Colorado, all the states that have been ending the death penalty have not been using it, and that creates space to say, is this working for us? But the work of the Southern Center in reducing death sentences, stopping executions, and many of the other amazing attorney shops across the country is essential to get to that next level, if that makes sense.
Terrica, would you mind jumping in to tell us a little bit about what that front end work looks like? I mean, I brought this up in the context of, the federal DOJ, but it really applies whoever the prosecutor is. What does it look like to try to stop the death penalty at the earliest stage? After the murder takes place, after the arrest is made, what does that work look like, and how is that work different in some of these very pro-death penalty states like Texas, Alabama, Georgia?
So I think it's a multi-pronged strategy, and it has to be. So in some cases, so for example, in the city of Atlanta metropolitan areas, communities have been able to get the new prosecutor and actually the old prosecutor to agree not to seek the death penalty and to say that on record. But that is metro, and that is not, does not represent the rest of the state. We have been working with a bipartisan group of folks in the legislature to actually submit a bill, HB 702, to end the death penalty in Georgia. We've been working on this for a long time. It did not go anywhere this session. One, because of dealing with the pandemic, the short nature of it, the back and forth, it didn't go anywhere, but also there was budget negotiations. And so there is bipartisan support for it in Georgia, and we're looking forward to doing what Laura just described, reducing the use of the death penalty. And so one of the ways is to see if we can convince prosecutors just not to seek the death penalty. Another way is to work with the legislature to attack it on a number of different levels. So talking about the racial disparities, working on intellectual disability, mental illness, a traumatic brain injury, a number of bias in jury selection, all of the ways that the death penalty is harmful. But the thing that I think, and I think Laura said this as well, is that you have to meet people where they are. And so in Georgia, it could be that, I remember, I'll just say this, I was on a panel many years ago, and we were talking about the death penalty, and there's prosecutor, et cetera. And there's this debate going back and forth about the moral implication of the death penalty and why it should end, et cetera. And there was this one guy in the audience who said, I'm just not moved by any of that. So can you tell me something that moves me related to the death penalty? And I started talking about how much it costs and how, at the time, I think there was a study or had been a investigation where there was a report, the sheriffs would prefer to have that money to spend on investigations rather than use it for the death penalty. And I started talking about the needs that their schools in his community could be, things that could be funded with that money. And that was the thing that moved him. So I think the thing is that we have to listen to the things that are important to folks to hear, and work and have conversations, like Laura mentioned, with folks on, and in terms of meeting folks where they are. Some people are going to be moved by the idea that the death penalty is immoral and wrong, and we should not kill people to show that killing people is wrong. But not everybody will be moved by that. And somebody who works in the Deep South and is really celebrating some of the changes that we see. But in fact, the Georgia legislature is still really Republican. It's still run by Republicans and majority Republicans. And so, folks voted for Biden, but that did not really change the makeup of the people who make the laws on the state level. And so we have to be cognizant of that. I'm actually curious about how discussions related to budgeting in this economy is going to impact our ability to have conversations with people who particularly are fiscal conservatives. I feel like this isn't a time when those kinds of conversations will be easier heard and people will pay a little bit more attention to it. But I think to answer your question, is a multi-pronged strategy. We use, it takes communications people to highlight the injustices. It takes folks on the ground holding elected officials accountable, saying, you're not going to do this in my name, and I vote. And we are watching, and we're going to hold you accountable. It takes litigation. It takes a strong capital defender office like we have in Georgia, where, we haven't had a death sentence. Well, we've only had one in the past 5 or 6 years. And even that one was a woman who represented herself who was mentally ill. And so, the South is different. But I think hopefully we will get to a place where the outlier states won't have so much sway, and we will get to the place where public opinion has shifted, and we're going to move forward without the death penalty going forward.
I'm curious, jumping off that, Sam and Laura, you both have experience in Western states where the abolition of the death penalty was sort of impossible without a serious amount of conservative support. Conservatism in the West is maybe different than conservatism or pro-death penalty feelings in the South. But I'm curious if there are sort of lessons from the West that you imagine applying to the South.
Yeah, that's a great point, Maurice. So, I was involved in the bill to abolish capital punishment that passed this year, and in the way that in the way that Terrica was just talking about. It really was broad and coalition based. So it was not just people like myself who've done empirical work on the unfairness of the death penalty. It was cost that was mentioned there, that the impact. And I see one of the questions in the Q&A talks about rural communities. Rural communities, the prosecutor's offices in rural communities would be overwhelmed by a single death penalty case, and were able to demonstrate that. It was also bringing together a faith community. A bunch of pastors and ministers and others from that community came and testified in opposition, or in support of the bill to abolish. And victims groups. We haven't talked much about victims groups today, but we had a number of victims' family members who talked about the repeated damage that was done to them by the long process of appeals, by the setting and changing of execution dates, and that and we can talk about life without parole at a different at a different panel, but that life without parole is a single instance, that when someone is sentenced to life without parole, which is the only other punishment in Colorado for first-degree murder, that's the end. And the person knows that criminal defendant won't be coming out again, and that person sort of disappears. And I think that was quite persuasive in the fact that while the prosecutor also marshaled a number of victims' family members and victim advocacy groups, the fact that that community was split and was not uniform in support of the death penalty, I think, was really a big mover.
I think that's a really great question too, to think about what which of our arguments have been persuasive with Republicans in the Western states could potentially work with conservatives in the Southern states. And my guess is some of them, yes, and but there would still be a gap. And I think it's because of the history of racial terror in the Southern states that that is part of the culture and the thinking in the states that is now, now we're having a national conversation about it, but it needs to be having a conversation in the South, with all the good work is getting done to do that. And I think that, that I would see is really important in those dialogues is lifting up the history of lynching. And, if you compare maps of where the most lynchings took place historically in the United States and who's currently executing people, they match up pretty evenly. And so I think that that's an element in the Southern states. But I do think that it is fascinating, as we talked about, the fact that you have to move away from the use to have the dialogue. If you look at Georgia, that has not sentenced anyone except that one person who represented herself to death in years. In Virginia, it's been 9 years. In North Carolina, it's been one over like 5 years, and they haven't executed anybody in a really long time. Those three states are really ripe for beginning this dialogue. And then, speaking to what Sam is, then we got to bring all those voices together. But those three Southern states, I do see that the same strategies that worked in Colorado and are working in Wyoming could be applied there. But we also have to name, I think, the issue of race, which, racism exists everywhere, but the history of oppression in those states, I think, adds another burden and another piece of the puzzle in terms of what we need to address.
I would just like to follow up on that last piece that you mentioned in terms of the racial history, because there was a hearing on a citizens arrest bill, and one of the speakers brought up the history of slavery and racism and lynching as it relates to citizens arrest. And there was a huge pushback from one of the legislators who was listening and who was really offended that that connection was being made. And so I just wanted to highlight that is also some of what we're facing, is sometimes telling the truth raises so much resistance that people choose not to hear it. And so I just want to lift that.
Thank you for that. It's time for us to open this up to broader Q&A from other participants in this call. The first one I'd like to highlight is actually in the chat log. It's from Charles Sullivan, and he says, "The Pope has called the life sentence a secret death penalty," in quotes. "Has there been any success of bringing together advocates to abolish the death penalty with advocates to abolish life sentences. I want to kind of add to that question just the fact that the decline of the death penalty has coincided with the massive expansion of life without parole. If the death penalty disappears tomorrow, the number of life without parole sentences will, I think, dwarf the number of death sentences that there ever were. And I imagine some of the resources that went into fighting harsh sentencing in the capital context could be applied outside of it. So I'm curious for any of you to kind of comment on that question of the relationship between the decline of the death penalty and the rise of life without parole.
Yeah, I think that's a really important observation. The possibility of life without parole has been a great weapon for death penalty abolitionists so far. Right, that is, it is an alternative that is tolerable to jurors, tolerable to legislators, that we can say, look, these people are never going to get out. It's just a question of whether they die, of old age in prison or whether they are executed. And it's, and I think that has been a very effective technique. But, for many of us who are involved in this movement, we're no fans of life without parole. And, when I was testifying on the death penalty abolition bill, one of the lead prosecutors, the prosecutors whose office is responsible for all the people on death row in Colorado, said, look, if you think Professor KAMIN isn't going to be back here asking you to abolish life without parole in a few years, you're out of your mind. And he's right. I mean, that's, that is the next step. I make no bones about that I think it's an equally inhumane punishment. And I just think that the movement has to there's going to be a tipping point where we move from saying life without possibility of parole is this alternative, it makes the death penalty unnecessary, to then attacking that very punishment that has been so important, I think, in helping people move past the death penalty.
Yeah, and I would just add, and I completely agree with just everything that Sam just said, is that it is a constant tension, I think, as for death penalty advocates, because we don't want to do the work in a way that is lifting up life without parole as like an alternative that's good, but and that's tricky, because we don't want to, but it comes up as like, oh, you can get rid of the death penalty because you have life without parole. And I think that our movement has had a lot of dialogue. I think it needs to have a lot more dialogue about how can we do the work where we are not in any way uplifting it. There's different strategic thinking in terms of, do you need to get rid of the death penalty first, like sequentially, before you get rid of life without parole? That's where I think I fall, but I always want to be reminding myself to rethink that and be open to different types of strategies. I know, Brian Stevenson has always said that, if you have the death penalty where it's okay to take a life, everything else seems okay from there. And so I think it's a really tough question. I can share that that it is a constant conversation that the advocacy side of the movement is having at all times, so that we do our best not to lift up life without parole and inhumane sentences, and to really put the death penalty in a category of excessive sentencing that goes all the way down to fines and fees of people who are thrown into jail, for not paying a traffic violation. And so I think that's how we need to frame things, that we're against excessive punishment and against excessive sentences. And I can finally just share is that, when a lot of work has been put into this draft of a bill that we're working on in Ohio, and a lot of it there's a lot of protections that currently exist under the Ohio statute for folks charged with capital crimes, that we're trying now to draft a bill to repeal it that would make them then apply to people facing life without parole. So there's a lot of this thinking is going on, but I don't want to profess to having a clear answer, because I think it's something that we're going to be struggling with it.
So I agree with everything that's been said, and I would underline the struggle. With part of that is that this is something that we do struggle with. As somebody who represents or has represented folks facing the death penalty, life without parole does feel like a better option. It is not a good option, but that's kind of where the sort of thinking goes when you think about, I'm talking about a real human life right here. I'm talking about a human being who's living and breathing and all of the things. But life without parole is hugely problematic, and it is just something that we have to figure out how to continue to have these conversations about and strategize around.
Thank you for that. It popped into my head while you all were speaking. While I was doing my own book research, I interviewed a prosecutor who had helped write the death penalty bill in the 1970s. And I asked him whether life without parole as an option had come up in conversation. And he said, no. And I said, why not? And he said, well, it was just understood that that was worse than the death penalty, that, you know, that even we hardened prosecutors couldn't countenance sending somebody to prison for the rest of their life with no hope of getting out. We thought that executing them would be more moral in a way than that. So it was a lesson in how these views shift over time and how much they can shift even in a couple of generations. Speaking of shifts that have happened over the last generation or so, I wanted to raise Hollis Whitson's question, which is what are everyone's opinions about carve-out efforts? Meaning, you know, the efforts to get the Supreme Court, the successful efforts to get the Supreme Court to abolish death sentences for people whose crime was committed before they were 18 years old or who are suffering from intellectual disability. I know that in some state courts, there have been efforts to raise that age to 21 and to encompass not just intellectual disability, but certain severe mental illnesses. What are y'all's opinions on these carve-out efforts? Or, as Hollis writes, have we reached the point where it is just as effective to argue for across-the-board abolition?
Hollis always asks good questions. So I think that the carve-outs have been really successful in doing the work that Laura was talking about in terms of reducing use of the death penalty, right? That every carve-out means fewer death-eligible people, it means fewer death sentences, it means fewer executions. There are still some out there, I would say, with felony murder that may be limiting the death penalty only to the killer rather than people who conspired with or worked with the killer. You know, there are other possibilities. You mentioned 21 or expanding mental disability. You know, so I think I'm not opposed to that work. I think that work is really important. And I think it contributes to the broader picture, right? Because the fewer death sentences there can be, the fewer death sentences there are, the more people come to realize that they can live and have a fair and safe and just society without the death penalty. And the fewer death sentences and the fewer executions, the more people are waking up to that possibility.
I think that's right. I think it's where should those challenges live? I think the litigation around the extension of Roper, you know, to not execute people under the age of 21 rather than 18 is really exciting. There's a lot more litigation, of course, around severe mental illness, and so I think that's a great. We need to constantly be pursuing that under state constitutions as well as under the federal constitution. Because there may be places where we may get a favorable decision under a state constitution analysis. I can say that from being involved in so many of these kind of legislative repeal campaigns, I've come to the conclusion that I think it's almost as hard. You know, so if you're going to try to pass a bill, like we've discussed a lot, should we try to pass bills to exclude the severely mentally ill from executions, which we of course all want to happen and all want to support. In a legislative effort, I'm not sure that's much easier than just passing repeal. You know, so it's just interesting because, as you know, opponents, just like they do on anything, will still refer to you, this is an abolition bill, or this is, you know, so then maybe we should just go for abolition if we think we can pass a reform. But that's not universal. I think it obviously depends on the state.
I think my answer is I'm just really not sure. Right now, we are working toward repeal, but I know people who are alive because of the carve-outs. And so until we get to, I'm not sure, like, I don't know where the tipping point is, and I'm not sure if we're there yet. But until we get there, I do think the carve-outs have a life-saving purpose. But I think we can do both at the same time. We can ask for repeal and carve-outs at the same time. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. And I wanted to highlight Jonathan Goddard's question, which is, wouldn't, as a condition of a federal death sentence, that a sentencing requirement that a DNA test be administered to the accused prior to execution help ensure that an innocent person is not killed? And I bring up that question. I'd love your reflections on it, your answers, and also to add to it the sort of larger question of innocence litigation, which is a part of the death penalty context, the capital context. Certainly when a death penalty case breaks through the news cycle, I see as a journalist, the big cases that thousands and thousands of readers pay attention to, it often is a case where there's a substantial question about the guilt of the defendant. And so I'm just curious, going forward, for everyone's reflections, both about that specific idea of DNA tests before execution and also just litigation around innocence as a method towards the sort of abolition goals that you all have described so far.
I can go first. I mean, I have obviously anything that can be put in place to ensure that innocent people are not convicted of any crime, and certainly not of a capital crime, is laudable. I do worry, and this goes to the previous question, about the tinkering with the machinery of death, right? That is saying, well, we're going to have a more humane federal death penalty. When we do that, are we sort of sanitizing the death penalty in a way that continues its success? So I do worry about that, though. I think so best case scenario obviously is a presidential commitment to no federal executions during his watch, to working toward elimination. A second best, and probably a distant second best, is a commitment to ensuring not just competent counsel, DNA, a hard look at who is seated in the jury. All of those questions at the federal level, I think, are really important. I do have this concern that sort of a technocratic approach is going to delay the eventual movement to undo the death penalty entirely.
My thoughts on that are twofold. One is, of course, the potential for executing an innocent person is a very, very strong message that resonates with a broad number of people. But in terms of having a statute that allows for DNA testing, that would not prevent wrongful executions, because only about 10 to 12% of murder cases have DNA evidence available. And we also know there's huge problems with national standards around other forensic evidence that is used at the state level in cases where there's little science that supports it, or they're not following standards about how you even conduct forensic analysis and all of that. There's just huge problems. And so that the innocence problem does not end if you put something in a statute that allows for DNA testing. But more importantly, kind of what Sam was alluding to is that, well, we love that powerful argument that we still want to center the problems of the death penalty around, is like, who gets sentenced to death? It's poor Black and brown people. It's people who've suffered trauma and abuse in their childhood. It's people who've suffered from severe mental illness. It's people who have intellectual disabilities. And these are the folks who are ended up being arbitrarily considered the worst of the worst in our country through some strange system that doesn't have the ability to make that determination of who's the worst and the worst. So of course, we support all reforms that would prevent wrongful convictions, but I think we just want to make sure that we're centering it appropriately.
I think I could just say ditto and be done, because those were things that I was going to lift up, is that not every case has DNA, and so it would not be effective for everybody. But I also would underline the caution to be careful, to not lift up innocence as the standard for determining whether or not the death penalty should exist. As Laura pointed out, there are just so many other things wrong with the death penalty, and it should not be the case that a person has to be innocent for our communities to determine that their life has meaning and is worth something, and that we should not, as a matter of law or policy, seek their death.
Wonderful. Well, with that, we are going to close out our hour here. I just want to go back to one announcement I made early on, which is that if you're in California and are looking for CLE credit for this hour, please email info@acslaw.org with the subject, with the name of the panel. And also, if you are seeking CLE credit in a jurisdiction other than California, please consult the rules of your state's CLE board to see if they provide reciprocity with California. CLE materials will be on the event page at the ACS website and also in a follow-up email from ACS, so have a look out for that. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to Mr. Feingold, everyone who put together this panel, the American Constitution Society, and we will see you again soon. Thanks.